Imagine a quieter version of history, where Viking settlers never left America, and time itself began to move more slowly. Along the far edges of the northern Atlantic shore, where fog lingered low over dark water, and the cries of seabirds softened into the steady breathing of the coast, small wooden hulls rested in shallow inlets, their shapes slowly weathering into the contours of the land. And nearby the first shelters stood not as statements of arrival, but as quiet answers to wind, cold and time, their timbers drawn from forests that leaned patiently toward the sea, their roofs weighted with sod and moss that gradually rooted themselves as if the houses had always belonged there. And as seasons passed, the people within them learned the rhythms of light and shadow, the long silver days of summer stretching gently into evenings that never fully darkened, and the deep winters when snow folded itself over the earth and sound grew distant and hushed, leaving only the slow creak of trees and the faint movement of ice along the shore. Over many generations, paths formed between water and forest, not carved sharply but pressed softly by repeated footsteps, and these paths wandered inland along rivers that carried cold clarity from lakes far beyond sight, and along those rivers canoes and boats drifted side by side, their designs reflecting different origins yet moving with the same current, their occupants sharing quiet glances and gestures more often than words, as fishing nets were mended on banks of smooth stone, and traps were set with careful respect for the cycles of return that governed fish and animal alike. And with the slow movement of time, the rivers themselves became teachers, showing when to wait, when to gather, and when to let things pass without taking. As years faded into decades, the forests remained vast and attentive, their canopies whispering through countless winters, and among the trees longhouses stretched low and sturdy, their forms gradually changing as local materials suggested gentler angles and broader openings, and nearby rounder dwellings rose with walls of bark, earth and woven reeds, and no single shape claimed permanence over another, because usefulness was valued more than origin, and warmth mattered more than memory, and quietly, year by year, these structures settled into shared clearings where smoke rose thin and pale into the morning air, carrying the mingled scents of resin, dried fish, and burning grasses. Languages, once distinct and sharply edged, began to soften where they met, their sounds smoothing through repetition and shared labor, and children grew hearing many ways of naming the same river, the same bird, the same season, until names became flexible things, shaped by mouth and meaning rather than rule, and stories were told beside low fires, not to instruct or persuade, but to remember how the land had spoken before, and how it continued to speak now, through the turning of leaves, the cracking of ice, and the return of light after long absence. With the passing of centuries, fields appeared in small openings where soil proved willing, and grains unfamiliar to the land at first were planted alongside native plants that had long fed those who listened to their habits. And harvests were modest and unhurried, gathered with hands accustomed to patience, and stored in ways learned from many winters of trial and quiet correction, and no sharp boundaries divided one way of living from another, because necessity encouraged cooperation more reliably than agreement ever could, and the land accepted only what it could sustain. Along the coasts, boats changed subtly in form, their keels adjusted to shallower waters, their sails cut to catch gentler winds, and oars dipped into the sea with steady rhythm rather than urgency. And as the tide moved in and out, It carried not only fish and kelp, but also knowledge, passed without ceremony from one pair of hands to another, and harbors remained small and open, defined more by familiarity than by construction, where vessels rested side by side through storms that arrived without announcement and departed without comment. As the centuries continued their quiet unfolding, clothing reflected the same blending that marked dwellings and speech, with wool woven alongside plant fibers, hide softened through methods learned by watching and repeating, and patterns emerged slowly, inspired by the shapes of leaves, waves, and migrating birds, rather than symbols of lineage or claim. And these garments aged with their wearers, repaired carefully and reused until they returned gently to the earth from which they came. Spiritual understandings followed a similar path, not merging into a single belief but overlapping like layers of mist, where reverence for ancestors rested comfortably beside respect for animals, and seasonal observances marked solstices and harvests without fanfare, guided more by observation than by doctrine, and places of quiet significance appeared along ridges, near springs, or beneath old trees whose roots had witnessed countless generations standing nearby, listening and leaving without disturbance. Time continued its patient work, smoothing distinctions and deepening familiarity, and children born along these coasts and rivers carried features that reflected many lines of descent, their lives shaped less by stories of crossing oceans than by intimate knowledge of weather, soil, and water, and they learned early how to move without haste, how to read the sky for changes too subtle to name, and how to sit in silence without needing to fill it. Further inland, settlements remained sparse and lightly held, connected by waterways rather than roads, and travel followed the contours of land rather than cutting across it. And maps, when they existed at all, were memory-based and flexible, adapting as rivers shifted and forests grew or thinned, and no fixed center drew everything toward itself, because life spread evenly where conditions allowed, and withdrew quietly where they did not. As decades folded into centuries once more, metal tools shared space with stone and bone, chosen not by novelty but by suitability, and craft traditions continued not as preserved relics but as living practices, changing slowly with each generation's adjustments. And workshops opened directly onto the land, allowing shavings, scraps, and sounds to disperse naturally rather than accumulate, and the boundary between making and living remained indistinct. The climate itself shifted gradually, bringing cooler currents some years and gentler winters in others, and the people adapted without urgency, adjusting planting times, altering shelter designs, and shifting migration routes for hunting and gathering, and these changes entered collective memory as variations rather than disruptions, absorbed into stories told softly during long evenings when snow pressed against walls and the world narrowed to firelight and breath. Over the long span of time, the presence of these communities did not announce itself through monuments or expansion, but through continuity, through the steady maintenance of relationships with land and water, and through the refusal to hurry the future. And travelers arriving from distant shores centuries later found not cities rising against the sky, but networks of small, enduring places, where life moved at the pace of seasons rather than ambition, and where greetings were exchanged calmly, without suspicion or ceremony. Rivers continued their slow journeys, carrying reflections of forests and clouds, and along their banks, children learned to recognize currents and eddies as familiar companions, and elders sat watching the water's surface, not in contemplation of meaning, but in acknowledgement of persistence, and boats passed occasionally, their wakes dissolving almost immediately, leaving the surface unchanged, as if nothing had moved through at all. With the gentle accumulation of time, North America itself became shaped by these quiet presences, not transformed but accompanied, its coastlines remaining wild and open, its forests deep and largely uninterrupted, and its human inhabitants woven into its patterns rather than set apart. And the land remembered this way of being through subtle markers, through clearings that never grew too large, through trails that curved rather than straightened, and through shorelines where wood and stone rested together in long familiarity. As seasons continued to pass, as they always had, snow fell and melted, leaves grew and returned to soil, tides rose and withdrew, and within this steady motion life carried on without seeking culmination, each generation adding its small adjustments to the ongoing conversation between people and place. And the wind moved through trees with the same sound it had always made, carrying with it traces of voices, footsteps and shared breath, not as echoes of something finished, but as part of a living, unbroken presence that remained quietly, patiently, endlessly attentive to the slow unfolding of time. And so the land continued its quiet remembering, holding within it the layered traces of footsteps that never pressed too hard, of hands that shaped wood and fiber with attention rather than force, and of voices that drifted across water and forest without seeking to dominate the air. And as seasons passed, the shoreline subtly rearranged itself, stones shifting under ice and tide, grasses reclaiming small clearings when use grew light, while dwellings were repaired and adjusted rather than replaced, their walls absorbing smoke and weather, until they seemed less constructed than grown, as if the forest had learned to fold itself into shelter. Along the rivers, where mist gathered in early hours and lifted slowly with the warming of pale sunlight, fishing continued in familiar patterns, nets lowered and raised with steady motion, baskets filled and emptied according to need, and the knowledge of when to stop remained as important as knowing when to begin, because abundance was understood not as accumulation but as balance, and this understanding passed gently between generations without instruction, embedded instead in daily repetition and quiet example. As decades slipped onward, gardens expanded and contracted in response to soil and weather, some seasons offering more than expected, others less, and neither abundance nor scarcity altered the calm pace of life, because storage, sharing and patience had long been woven into habit, and the rhythms of preparation mattered more than the outcomes they produced, and even children learned to recognize the subtle signs of change in leaf color, bird movement, and wind direction, reading them not as warnings, but as information offered freely by the land. Further along the coast, small harbors continued to host gatherings that followed the tide rather than the calendar, where boats arrived carrying dried fish, carved tools, woven cloth, or stories gathered from distant inlets, and these meetings unfolded slowly, marked by long silences as much as conversation, as goods changed hands without hurry, and news was absorbed thoughtfully. And when the tide turned, departures occurred as naturally as arrivals, without ceremony or lingering. Over many generations, the blending of cultures deepened, not through deliberate union, but through shared experience, and family lines traced themselves through both Norse and indigenous ancestry without emphasizing distinction, and the sense of belonging attached itself more firmly to particular valleys, river bends, or stretches of shoreline than to any distant origin. And songs sung softly during work carried melodies that drifted between traditions, their words flexible, sometimes changing from one telling to the next, shaped by memory rather than preservation. Architecture continued its gradual evolution, with long, low structures opening more fully to summer breezes, their entrances aligned with prevailing winds, learned over years of observation, and smaller dwellings nestled close to trees for shelter, and storage spaces built partially underground, where temperature remained steady, and each construction decision reflected a long familiarity with place, not innovation for its own sake, but adaptation refined through time. As centuries unfolded quietly, the land itself bore subtle signs of this enduring presence, not through large alterations, but through patterns of use that encouraged renewal. Forests thinned gently rather than cleared, allowing light to reach understory plants, and animal populations remained stable through careful attention to cycles, and waterways flowed clear, their banks reinforced with roots rather than stone, and this continuity allowed the environment to remain resilient, capable of absorbing change without losing character. Occasionally, travelers arrived from far across the sea, guided by currents and chance rather than intention, and they encountered communities that did not announce themselves with walls or towers, but with smoke rising faintly among trees and the quiet sound of work carried on without pause. And these visitors found themselves received without suspicion or urgency, offered shelter, warmth, and food, and left with memories of a way of living that seemed less concerned with arrival or departure than with remaining attentive to what was already present. Inland, beyond the reach of salt air, life continued along lakes and smaller rivers, where winter ice provided pathways and summer waters reflected endless sky, and seasonal movement followed familiar loops rather than linear expansion, and campsites returned to year after year showed little sign of wear, because use was light and deliberate, and the land recovered quickly between visits, maintaining its sense of continuity. Spiritual practices remained quiet and personal, often expressed through simple acts of acknowledgement rather than ritual. A pause before taking from the land, a moment of stillness at the change of season, and these gestures blended seamlessly into daily activity, leaving no separate spaces set aside exclusively for belief, because reverence was understood as a manner of moving through the world rather than something confined to specific times or places. As the long flow of time continued, knowledge accumulated not in written records alone, but in memory, in the way hands moved instinctively while shaping tools, in the way eyes scanned the horizon for weather signs, and in the way voices lowered naturally during evening hours, matching the fading light. And elders shared their understanding not through instruction but through presence, allowing younger generations to absorb patterns through proximity and repetition. The climate shifted again, subtly and slowly, bringing longer winters for a time, and then milder ones, and communities adjusted their dwellings and storage accordingly, deepening insulation, altering roof angles, shifting planting choices. And these changes occurred without urgency, because flexibility had long been part of life. and the land continued to offer guidance to those who observed carefully. Through all of this, there remained no sense of culmination, no belief that life was progressing toward a defined outcome, because continuity itself was sufficient, and the land held each generation as it had held the last, offering space, resources, and quiet companionship. And the people moved within this space with familiarity and care, leaving room for growth, for retreat, and for return. The wind continued to travel across forests and open water, carrying the faint sounds of axes meeting wood, of paddles touching water, of voices blending with birdsong, and these sounds rose and faded without leaving sharp traces, becoming part of the background rhythm of the place. And as night settled and stars appeared, reflected in still lakes and slow rivers, life carried on in its unhurried way, woven into the land's long memory, continuing without pause, without destination, and without end. And with the quiet turning of nights into mornings, frost forming and loosening its hold on grasses and shorelines, the people remained attentive to small shifts that required no announcement, noticing how the angle of light changed across familiar clearings, how certain birds lingered longer some years and departed earlier in others, and how the water along the inlets carried different textures depending on wind and temperature. And these observations settled into shared awareness without being recorded or emphasized, becoming simply part of how the world was read and lived within. As generations continued to layer themselves gently into the landscape, paths between dwellings softened further, sometimes disappearing entirely beneath leaf fall or new growth, only to reappear when needed, and no effort was made to keep them fixed, because movement followed memory more than marking, and children learned roots by following elders at an unhurried pace, absorbing the turns and pauses as naturally as breath. And in this way, orientation belonged not to signs or structures, but to relationship with place. Along sheltered bays, seaweed was gathered carefully and returned in part to fields and gardens, enriching soil that had already learned to support both native plants and those introduced long ago. And this cycle repeated quietly year after year, not as a practice defined by rule, but as a response refined through observation. And the scent of drying kelp mixed with wood smoke during certain seasons, becoming a familiar signal of time passing without needing names. The sharing of labor remained fluid, adjusting to circumstance rather than schedule, and when storms pressed in from the open sea, boats were drawn higher and secured together, hands working side by side in silence, and afterward repairs were made slowly, with attention to balance and durability rather than speed. And these moments reinforced a sense of collective steadiness, an understanding that the land and water would always require patience in return for what they offered. Further inland, hunting followed patterns that respected migration and renewal, with routes shifting gently as animal paths changed, and the knowledge of tracking rested not in dominance but in familiarity, recognizing signs as indications of presence rather than targets. And when animals were taken, their use extended carefully, hides softened and shaped, sinew stored, bones returned to the forest floor or water, completing cycles that felt continuous rather than extractive. Over long spans of time, gatherings occurred naturally at points where rivers met, or where seasonal abundance encouraged meeting, and these occasions unfolded slowly, marked by shared meals, tool exchange, and extended periods of listening, and stories shared during these times rarely focused on beginnings or achievements, instead lingering on weather patterns, memorable seasons, or subtle changes noticed in particular places, and these narratives blended freely, reshaped by each retelling without concern for precision. The blending of belief systems continued quietly, with old symbols losing sharp boundaries and new meanings forming gently around shared experience, and certain trees, stones, or stretches of water gained significance through repeated presence rather than designation, and people paused there instinctively, acknowledging continuity without formal gesture, and moved on, leaving the place unchanged except for the passing of time itself. As centuries continued their unmarked progression, writing appeared in limited forms, used occasionally for practical memory, marking cycles, agreements, or observations of weather, yet oral transmission remained primary because spoken knowledge adapted more easily to change, and memory held flexibility that written marks could not, and this balance persisted without tension, each method existing where it proved useful. The shoreline itself shifted imperceptibly, storms rearranging stones, tides carving new curves into sand, and dwellings responded by adjusting position rather than resisting movement, some relocating slightly inland, others rebuilt closer to water as conditions allowed, and this willingness to move with the land prevented the accumulation of loss, keeping attachment light and adaptable. As the long continuity carried forward, the wider world beyond these coasts changed in ways only partially felt here, filtered through occasional arrivals and distant accounts, yet daily life remained anchored in immediate surroundings, in the texture of soil, the clarity of water, and the consistency of seasonal return. And this focus preserved a sense of calm that endured despite distant variation. The forests continued to mature, old trees falling and opening space for new growth, and these changes were accepted without intervention unless needed for shelter or warmth, and even then taken sparingly, allowing the forest to maintain its layered depth, and trails shifted accordingly, bending around fallen trunks rather than clearing them away, reinforcing a pattern of accommodation rather than alteration. As night settled again, as it always did, light from hearths glowed softly through openings in walls, smoke drifting upward and dispersing into the cold air. And within these shelters, quiet movement continued, tools repaired, fibers twisted, food prepared for the coming days, and outside, snow or rain fell with equal patience, absorbed into ground and water, continuing cycles older than memory. And so the land held these lives gently, not as a chapter or an era, but as an ongoing presence, a steady rhythm woven into wind, water, and soil, where the blending of people and place required no conclusion, no culmination, only continued attention to the slow, enduring movement of time as it carried everything forward, softly, without pause and without end. And as the slow procession of seasons carried on, the early light of spring continued to arrive quietly along the edges of frozen ground, loosening it grain by grain, and water traced familiar paths through soil that remembered where it preferred to move, and people noticed these shifts not as events but as confirmations, signs that the world was proceeding as it had learned to do, and work adjusted gently, tools brought out from storage, hands reacquainting themselves with textures long known, and nothing required haste, because the land revealed its readiness gradually. Along the forest margins, sap rose in trees with patient consistency, and small cuts allowed it to be gathered sparingly, sweetening food and drink in ways that linked memory to taste, and the process itself became a marker of time, not fixed to a date, to a feeling sensed collectively, when nights softened and birds returned in greater number, filling the air with layered sound that drifted through clearings and lingered without demanding attention. As the rivers freed themselves from ice, movement resumed along their surfaces, boats sliding into water that reflected sky and branch, and travel remained purposeful yet unforced, following needs that arose naturally rather than plans made far in advance. And when people met along these routes, exchanges unfolded with familiarity, news shared slowly, sometimes interrupted by long pauses where listening mattered more than speaking, and the water continued to move beneath them, carrying everything onward. Gardens once again found their shape through careful tending, soil turned lightly, seeds placed where experience suggested they would thrive, and these acts repeated patterns established long ago, refined subtly each year as conditions shifted, and the success of growth remained secondary to the act of participation itself. The quiet collaboration between human effort and the responsiveness of the earth. Summer arrived without announcement, days stretching longer, light lingering across water and meadow, and activity extended naturally into evening hours, work blending seamlessly into rest, and gatherings occurred outdoors more often, meals shared beneath open sky, and the sense of separation between shelter and land diminished, as if walls were present only when needed and otherwise dissolved into the surrounding space. Fishing followed the movements of schools along the coast, timing learned through years of observation rather than calculation, and the sea offered what it could, sometimes more, sometimes less, and acceptance of this variability remained embedded in practice, preventing strain or disappointment from taking root. And the return of boats at day's end brought familiar rhythms back to shore, nets hung to dry, catches prepared calmly, and conversation remaining low and unhurried. As warmth slowly gave way to cooler air, the forest shifted again, leaves changing color and returning to ground, enriching it quietly, and people adjusted their routines accordingly, preserving food, reinforcing shelters, gathering fuel with the same measured approach that defined all preparation. And these actions carried no sense of urgency because anticipation had long replaced reaction and experience guided effort. Autumn light settled into shorter days, and with it came a deeper stillness, broken only by wind moving through branches and the occasional call of migrating birds overhead. And this period invited reflection without introspection, attention turning inward only as much as needed to maintain balance, and evenings grew longer, filled with steady tasks performed by firelight, hands moving rhythmically, guided by habit rather than thought. Winter returned as it always had, drawing everything inward, covering familiar shapes with snow, softening edges, quieting sound. And within this enclosure, life continued at a slower pace. Stories shared when words felt appropriate, silence embraced when it did not, and the outside world remained present through the subtle sounds of wind and settling ice, reminding those within of the broader continuity beyond shelter. Through all of this, no single moment marked progress or change in isolation, because time flowed evenly, smoothing distinctions between past and present, and the land continued to hold memory not as record but as condition, shaping what was possible and what felt natural, and the people moved within this field of continuity with ease, their lives unfolding gently alongside rivers, forests, and coastlines that remained patient, attentive, and quietly enduring. allowing everything to continue, softly, without interruption and without end. And beneath the layered stillness of winter, when snow pressed softly against trunks and shorelines, and the sky carried a muted brightness even at midday, the deeper rhythms of life remained steady, felt more than seen, as stored foods were used carefully, fires were tended with measured attention, and movement slowed to match the quiet persistence of the season. And this slowing did not signal pause but alignment, a matching of human pace to the land's long exhale. Within shelters, light shifted gently across walls darkened by years of smoke, revealing textures shaped by countless hands, and the sounds of daily activity remained subdued. The scrape of wood against wood, the soft pull of fiber being twisted, the low murmur of shared presence, and these sounds blended into the background, never rising above the hush imposed by snow and distance. And outside, animal tracks appeared and vanished again beneath fresh fall, marking passage without permanence. As the cold gradually eased its hold, subtle changes announced themselves quietly, snow softening underfoot, water beginning to move beneath ice, and the air carrying a different weight, sensed instinctively rather than measured, and people responded without discussion, adjusting routines, preparing tools, and stepping outward more often. Not because a season had begun, but because conditions allowed for it, and allowance had always guided action more reliably than intention. The return of open water invited renewed movement along familiar routes, boats sliding free from winter rest, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use, and travel resumed not as expansion but as reconnection, threads drawn taut once more between places long known, and these journeys unfolded slowly, punctuated by stops along banks where signs of renewal appeared in early plants and shifting bird calls, and observation remained as important as destination. As spring settled more fully into the land, the forests responded with layered growth, understory plants emerging first, followed by leaves unfolding overhead, and light filtered differently through this renewed canopy, creating patterns on ground and water that shifted hour by hour. And people moved through these spaces with familiarity, adjusting paths slightly to accommodate growth, allowing vegetation to reclaim areas left unused, and this reciprocity sustained the sense of balance that had long defined presence here. Along the coast, tides continued their steady rhythm, shaping daily activity more than any external measure of time, and work aligned itself naturally with these movements, fishing, gathering, repairing, resting, all fitting into the spaces created by rising and falling water. And the sea offered its changes without explanation, sometimes calm, sometimes textured by wind, and acceptance remained the primary response, reinforced through generations of living close to its edge. Children grew within this environment, absorbing patterns rather than instructions, learning to read the land through shared activity, their understanding shaped by repetition and example. And as they matured, their contributions emerged gradually, woven into the existing fabric without disruption, and elders observed these transitions quietly, offering guidance only when necessary, trusting the continuity of practice to carry knowledge forward. As decades accumulated gently, the distinctions between old and new became increasingly subtle. Tools altered slightly in form, songs shifted in tone, dwellings adapted to changing needs, yet no moment stood apart as transformative because change itself remained incremental. layered into daily life without announcement, and memory adjusted alongside it, preserving what mattered through use rather than record. Occasionally, traces of distant developments reached these regions, fragments of information carried by travelers or exchanged along waterways, and these accounts were received without urgency, considered alongside local experience, and integrated only where they aligned with established rhythms. And in this way, the wider world remained present but never dominant. Its influence filtered through the steady lens of place. The land itself continued to shape these choices, offering guidance through its responses, soil yielding more readily where care persisted, water remaining clear where disturbance stayed light, and wildlife maintaining presence where cycles were respected. And these feedbacks reinforced behaviors quietly, ensuring continuity without the need for enforcement or decree. As the long continuity carried onward, nights lengthened and shortened again, stars tracing familiar paths across the sky, reflected faintly in still waters, and these patterns offered reassurance not through meaning but through consistency, a reminder of scale and persistence that framed human life as part of a broader, enduring movement. And so, within this steady unfolding, life continued to settle and resettle into itself, shaped by land and time rather than ambition, each day blending into the next without boundary, each generation adding its subtle inflection to an ongoing presence that neither began nor moved toward conclusion, but remained attentive and enduring, carried forward quietly by wind, water, and the patient passage of time. And as the passage of time continued to drift forward with the same unhurried steadiness, the mornings arrived with subtle variations that only careful familiarity could detect, a slightly altered quality of light, a different pattern in the mist rising from water, a shift in how sound traveled across open space, and these details were noticed not as novelties, but as confirmations that the land remained alive and responsive, continuing its quiet conversation with those who lived within it. Along the margins of forest and field, the work of tending and gathering resumed in cycles so well known that they required little discussion, hands reaching for tools shaped by long use, movements guided by memory stored in muscle rather than thought. And as plants matured and were harvested, portions were always returned to the soil, composted gently, ensuring that nourishment flowed back into the ground as steadily as it was drawn out, maintaining a balance that felt neither calculated nor accidental. The rivers, always present, continued their slow reshaping of banks and bends, carrying fine sediment downstream, smoothing stones, and creating new shallows where fish gathered in certain seasons, and people adjusted their routes accordingly, launching from slightly different points, stepping carefully where currents had shifted, and this responsiveness prevented stagnation, keeping both movement and knowledge flexible and alive. In the quieter hours, when activity eased naturally and the world settled into a slower rhythm, attention often turned outward rather than inward, watching clouds form and dissolve, observing how shadows lengthened across familiar ground, and these moments required no interpretation, offering instead a steady sense of continuity, an awareness that life unfolded within a much larger pattern that asked only for patience and care. As the years continued to layer themselves gently, the blending of languages persisted, phrases shortening, sounds softening, meanings broadening to encompass shared experience. and communication relied increasingly on tone, gesture, and context, reducing the need for precision while deepening mutual understanding. And silence itself became a familiar mode of exchange, carrying comfort rather than absence. Shelters aged gracefully, timbers darkening, roofs settling, and when repairs were needed, they were undertaken gradually, often involving multiple households without formal coordination, each contribution fitting naturally into the whole, reinforcing a sense of shared responsibility that required no explicit agreement, because it had long been embedded in daily practice. Further inland, seasonal movements continued to trace gentle loops across the landscape, camps established and released without leaving scars, fires built and allowed to fade completely, and these temporary presences reinforced the understanding that belonging did not require permanence in a single location, but attentiveness wherever one happened to be. As weather patterns shifted subtly over decades, bringing changes in precipitation or temperature, responses emerged slowly, adjustments made to planting choices, shelter design, and travel timing. And these adaptations occurred without resistance, because flexibility had always been valued over fixation, and the land remained a constant guide through its feedback and rhythms. Through all of this, the absence of urgency remained striking, life proceeding without the pressure to accumulate or expand, content instead with maintenance and continuity. And this quality shaped interactions, reducing conflict and allowing differences to coexist without resolution, because coexistence itself was sufficient. Night after night, the sky continued its familiar display, stars moving along ancient paths, occasionally obscured by cloud or snowfall, and these variations were accepted as part of the same steady whole, offering no message beyond presence. And beneath this sky, along coasts, rivers, and forests, the quiet weaving of lives continued, threads interlacing gently, forming a fabric that did not seek completion, only persistence, carried forward softly, endlessly by the land's own enduring breath. And with the same measured calm, the land continued to shape each day without distinction between what had been and what was becoming. As morning light settled differently depending on cloud and season, sometimes diffused through mist rising from damp ground, sometimes sharp against frost or clear water, and these variations were absorbed quietly into routine, influencing movement and work without requiring comment or decision, because attention itself guided response. Along the water's edge, stones worn smooth by centuries of tide and current remained where they had always been, even as their arrangement shifted slightly with storms and thaw, and people stepping among them adjusted instinctively, learning anew each season where footing felt secure, and this constant, gentle relearning prevented complacency, keeping awareness active without strain. Food preparation followed rhythms refined over long familiarity, drying, smoking, fermenting, and storing, carried out with the same patient care regardless of yield, and flavors developed slowly, shaped by climate and method rather than novelty. And meals were shared simply, eaten without hurry, often accompanied by long pauses in conversation where listening to wind, water, or fire felt sufficient. As children grew and took on greater responsibility, their understanding deepened not through instruction, but through participation, observing how elders read weather from subtle signs, how they adjusted plans without announcing change, and how they recognized limits without seeing them as constraints. And this learning settled gradually, becoming part of how each new generation moved through the world. The forests continued their quiet cycles, growth and decay interwoven, fallen trees nourishing soil, new shoots emerging in filtered light, and people navigated these spaces with care, harvesting selectively, leaving stands untouched where regeneration required time. And this restraint ensured that familiar routes remained passable while the forest retained its layered depth and diversity. Occasionally, clearings shifted location as soil tired or growth reclaimed space, and these changes were accepted without regret. Shelters relocated or reoriented to suit new conditions, and materials reused wherever possible, reinforcing a sense that permanence resided not in structures but in relationships, both with land and with one another. Along the coast, seasonal gatherings continued to arise naturally, shaped by abundance rather than schedule, and during these times, shared labor and quiet exchange reinforced bonds that required no reaffirmation, because they were maintained through regular contact and mutual reliance. And when the gatherings dispersed, traces faded quickly, leaving shorelines much as they had been before. The blending of traditions remained ongoing and unremarked, tools combining features from different origins, stories incorporating elements from multiple lineages, and beliefs expressed through action rather than statement. And over time, these blended forms felt less like combinations and more like continuations, expressions shaped by place rather than provenance. As years folded into decades and decades into centuries, the sense of time itself remained diffuse, marked by environmental cues rather than counted intervals, and memory stretched backward and forward without clear boundary, connecting individuals to ancestors they had never known personally through shared practices and familiar landscapes. Weather continued its slow variations, cycles of cooler and warmer periods unfolding without drama, and adaptations followed naturally. Insulation thickened or reduced, travel patterns adjusted, and expectations shifted gently, maintaining continuity without resistance, and the land responded in turn, offering stability through its own capacity to absorb change. In moments of stillness, when activity paused naturally and the world seemed to hold its breath, the presence of continuity felt most apparent, not as an idea, but as a condition, sensed in the way sound traveled, in the way light rested on surfaces, and in the ease with which life resumed its flow afterward, unchanged in essence. And so the quiet coexistence endured, carried by rivers that continued their journeys, forests that renewed themselves patiently, and coastlines shaped by the steady meeting of water and land. And within this living framework, human presence remained woven rather than imposed, contributing its subtle patterns to an ongoing fabric that neither sought an end nor acknowledged a beginning, continuing softly, steadily, as time itself moved on without pause. And in the steady continuation of days that followed one another without distinction, the land maintained its gentle influence, guiding movement and rest through cues so subtle they often passed unnoticed until absence revealed their importance. A particular stillness in the air before snow, a change in how waves met the shore when currents shifted far out at sea, and these signs entered awareness quietly, shaping response without ever demanding attention. Along the edges of wetlands and slow-moving streams, Reeds and grasses thickened and thinned according to water levels that varied year by year, and people gathered these materials patiently, cutting only what would regrow easily, weaving them into mats, baskets, and coverings that carried the scent of water and earth long after they were brought indoors. And these objects aged alongside their makers, softening with use, repaired when needed, and eventually returned to the land from which they came. The movement of animals continued to influence daily life more than any abstract measure of time, herds appearing and withdrawing, birds arriving and leaving, fish changing depth and direction, and these patterns were followed attentively, not as pursuits but as shared rhythms. And when conditions altered, the people altered with them, shifting effort elsewhere, allowing space for recovery, and this responsiveness sustained both abundance and restraint. As the sun traced its slow arc across the sky through the seasons, light entered dwellings at different angles, illuminating familiar surfaces in new ways, and these changes were noticed in passing, adding quiet variation to daily routines, and evenings gathered gradually, bringing with them a natural inclination toward rest, conversation softening, tasks slowing, and silence becoming more frequent and comfortable. Over generations, craftsmanship continued to evolve gently, each maker adding small refinements learned through experience, and tools carried the marks of many hands, surfaces polished through repeated use, handles reshaped unconsciously to better fit the grip, and these objects embodied continuity not through preservation but through adaptation, their forms changing as needs and understanding deepened. Further along the river systems, connections between distant communities persisted through intermittent travel, knowledge flowing slowly, ideas exchanged without urgency, and innovations adopted selectively, only where they complemented existing practices, and in this way the broader network remained cohesive without central coordination, bound instead by shared values of attentiveness and moderation. The sounds of life remained subdued, blending naturally into the surrounding environment, the rhythm of paddles touching water, the muted strike of tools against wood or bone, the low tones of voices carried briefly before dissolving into open space. And even during periods of collective effort, the atmosphere remained calm, focused, and unhurried. As climatic cycles continued their gradual shifts, altering precipitation patterns and growing seasons, responses unfolded across years rather than moments. Adjustments layered gently one upon another, maintaining balance without abrupt change, and the land responded in turn, demonstrating resilience through diversity and regeneration, reinforcing the wisdom of measured presence. In the quieter intervals between activity, observation remained a constant practice, eyes tracing the movement of clouds, ears attuned to distant sounds, and this attentiveness extended beyond necessity, becoming a way of inhabiting time fully, allowing moments to exist without purpose or outcome, and these moments accumulated, forming a sense of continuity that required no articulation. And so the lives along these coasts, rivers, and forests continued to unfold within the same enduring framework, shaped by patience rather than intent, guided by the land's steady cues, and sustained through practices that honored renewal over accumulation. And as wind moved through branches and water carried reflections onward, the quiet blending of people and place persisted, unbroken, attentive, and ongoing, carried forward gently by the slow, inexhaustible passage of time. And within this ongoing steadiness, the subtle exchanges between land and life continued to unfold without emphasis, as mornings opened into days that differed only in small, instructive ways. A breeze arriving from a slightly altered direction, moisture lingering longer on leaves, the ground yielding more softly underfoot, and these details guided choices instinctively, shaping routes taken, tasks selected, and moments of rest without requiring deliberation. Along the inland waterways, reflections shifted constantly, sky and tree line dissolving and reforming with each movement of current. And people traveling these waters learn to read depth and flow from color and texture alone, adjusting speed and direction with gentle movements that left little trace. And when stopping along the banks, they chose places already shaped by past use, avoiding unnecessary disturbance, allowing the river's edge to remain largely unchanged. In forest clearings, small fires were kindled and allowed to burn low, their warmth contained, their smoke rising straight when air was still, dispersing quickly when wind passed through, and these fires served multiple purposes at once, offering heat, light, and a focal point for shared presence, without becoming central or dominant, and when extinguished, their remains were scattered lightly, returning ash to soil that welcomed it. As time continued its slow accumulation, the understanding of weather deepened further, not through prediction but through familiarity, knowing when clouds carried rain that would pass quickly and when they signaled longer shifts, sensing changes in pressure through the body as much as through sight, and this awareness reduced surprise, allowing life to adjust fluidly to conditions as they emerged. The materials of daily life continued to circulate gently between use and renewal, wood repurposed as it aged, fibers reworked, tools reshaped, and nothing was discarded abruptly, because even worn objects retained value in the lessons they offered, guiding future making through the memory of what had lasted and what had not. Children moved freely between spaces, water, forest, and shelter, learning boundaries through experience rather than restriction. And this freedom fostered confidence tempered by respect, as the land itself provided feedback, teaching caution near deep water, patience during difficult weather, and attentiveness to subtle cues that signaled change. As years blended into one another, the sense of lineage remained diffuse, not traced through formal records but through shared habits, recognizable gestures, and familiar ways of approaching tasks. And ancestry was felt more through continuity of practice than through names or stories, embedded in how hands worked and how attention was directed. The coastline, shaped endlessly by tide and weather, continued to host quiet activity, boats coming and going without schedule, their presence marked briefly by movement and sound before blending back into stillness. And the sea remained both provider and companion, its variations accepted without interpretation, its constancy recognized beneath surface change. Inland, seasonal camps appeared and faded as before, leaving little behind, and the land absorbed these presences easily, grasses bending and rising again, soil settling, and this light footprint reinforced a sense of belonging that did not rely on permanence, allowing movement without loss and return without disruption. Through all of this, the absence of sharp boundaries persisted, between work and rest, between tradition and adaptation, between people and place, and this permeability allowed life to remain responsive, avoiding rigidity, and fostering a calm resilience that carried through generations without conscious preservation. And so, as light shifted once more, as water continued its quiet courses, And as forests renewed themselves through growth and decay, the lives woven into these patterns continued alongside them, neither foreground nor background, simply present, attentive and enduring, moving forward without destination, sustained by the same gentle, unbroken flow that had always carried them, and that continued softly, endlessly, without pause. And with each gradual turning of the earth beneath the sky, the land continued to offer its guidance in quiet increments, never insisting, never withdrawing, only presenting conditions as they were, and life adjusted accordingly, the pace of movement slowing or easing forward in response to temperature, light, and moisture. And this responsiveness became so ingrained that intention often followed action rather than preceding it. Along the higher ground, where forests thinned into open stretches of rock and low growth, wind moved more freely, shaping vegetation into forms that reflected long exposure, and people passing through these areas learned to read shelter in the curve of stone or the lean of a stand of trees, pausing where the land itself suggested rest, and continuing where openness invited motion. And these decisions were made without conscious weighing, guided instead by familiarity that had accumulated quietly over lifetimes. Water remained the primary thread connecting distant places, and along its course small markers of use appeared and faded. Stones set aside to steady a landing, branches trimmed to ease passage, and these adjustments remained subtle enough that the river's own character dominated, its voice carrying over any human presence, and those who traveled it did so with awareness of its moods, accepting delays or diversions as part of the journey rather than interruptions. In times of abundance, sharing extended naturally beyond immediate circles, goods moving along waterways and paths without formal exchange, carried as offerings rather than commodities. And in leaner periods, restraint became collective, expectations narrowing quietly, and this balance prevented extremes from shaping memory too strongly, allowing experience to remain even, without sharp contrasts that demanded resolution. The forests continued their layered conversations, insects emerging and withdrawing, birds nesting and moving on, mammals passing through with little notice, and people remained one presence among many, adjusting their own activity to avoid disturbance when possible, and when interaction occurred, it was brief and contained, leaving patterns largely intact. As light shifted across seasons, interior spaces changed character, darker months drawing attention inward, brighter periods dissolving the boundary between inside and outside, and dwellings adapted accordingly. Openings widened or closed, coverings added or removed, and these adjustments occurred with little effort, because structures had been shaped from the beginning to respond rather than resist. Knowledge continued to pass quietly between generations, not as instruction but as shared time, children observing how elders paused before acting, how they listened to conditions, how they accepted uncertainty without discomfort, and these habits formed the foundation of understanding, reinforcing patience as a default response. Occasionally, moments arose when collective effort was required, repairing damage after storms, relocating structures threatened by erosion, assisting those whose capacity had diminished with age. And these moments unfolded calmly, tasks divided without discussion, contributions offered without acknowledgement. And when the work was complete, life returned seamlessly to its familiar rhythm. As decades continued their gentle accumulation, Subtle shifts in vegetation and wildlife reflected longer cycles at work, species adapting their ranges, growth patterns changing, and people adjusted alongside these shifts, not seeking to restore a previous state, but accommodating what emerged, trusting the land's capacity to reorganize itself over time. Sound remained a secondary presence, never dominating, always contextual, carried briefly and then absorbed, and silence itself held texture, shaped by distance, weather, and terrain. And this quiet allowed awareness to extend outward, encompassing subtle movements and changes that might otherwise be overlooked. And within this expansive calm, the blending of lives, cultures, and land persisted without emphasis, woven together through daily acts of care and attention. And as wind continued to move across water and forest, carrying traces of scent and sound onward, the story of this place continued not as a sequence of events, but as an enduring state of being, unfolding gently, without conclusion, sustained by the same patient flow that had always guided it forward, and that remained quietly and endlessly in motion. And so the days continued to lean into one another, each shaped less by intention than by the quiet circumstances that surrounded it, as morning air carried different textures depending on season and weather, sometimes crisp and resonant, sometimes softened by moisture or warmth, and these sensations settled into the body before thought arose, guiding movement, posture, and pace in ways so familiar they no longer felt learned. Along the meeting places of forest and water, where roots reached into damp soil and stones gathered at bends in the current, people paused often, not out of necessity but because such places invited stillness, and here small tasks were completed with care, tools rinsed, bundles adjusted, observations exchanged in few words or none at all, and then movement resumed, following paths that curved gently away without urgency. The flow of materials through daily life remained cyclical and measured, fish becoming food and bone becoming tool, plants becoming fiber and then returning as compost, and this circulation reduced waste without effort because it followed patterns already present in the land, and attention remained focused on continuity rather than efficiency, allowing processes to unfold at their own pace. As the seasons progressed once more, subtle regional differences asserted themselves gently, coastal air carrying salt and motion, inland forests holding cooler shadows, higher ground offering broader views and stronger wind, and communities adapted locally, developing slight variations in shelter, clothing, and routine that reflected immediate surroundings, while still remaining connected through shared understanding and frequent unhurried contact. Children continued to grow into these patterns gradually, learning not through formal boundary, but through gentle correction offered by experience. A cold stream discouraging careless entry, a shifting shoreline teaching awareness of tide, and this learning embedded respect naturally, shaping behavior without imposing fear or rule. Evenings gathered as they always had, light withdrawing slowly, shadows lengthening, activity narrowing to tasks suited for low illumination, and conversation softened, punctuated by pauses that felt complete rather than empty, and the presence of others was acknowledged simply through proximity, through shared warmth and quiet motion. As time stretched onward, the landscape itself recorded these lives not through marks or structures, but through subtle influences. Meadows maintained through careful use, waterways kept clear through restraint, forest edges shaped by selective harvesting, and these imprints blended so thoroughly into natural processes that they appeared indistinguishable from them, reinforcing the sense that human presence belonged rather than intruded. Occasional storms passed through, reshaping coastlines slightly, dropping trees, altering familiar paths, and responses followed without alarm. Debris cleared where needed, routes adjusted, materials repurposed, and these disruptions entered memory as part of the ongoing variability of place rather than as defining moments, absorbed into the larger pattern without lingering emphasis. As generations continued their quiet succession, the accumulated knowledge of living within this environment remained distributed rather than centralized, held collectively in habits, expectations, and shared responses, ensuring resilience without hierarchy and allowing continuity to persist even as individual lives faded and were replaced by others equally attentive. The night sky continued its slow, predictable movement, stars shifting position across seasons, moonlight altering the texture of familiar spaces, and these celestial patterns offered a broader frame within which daily concerns felt appropriately small, encouraging patience and perspective without conscious reflection. And within this vast yet intimate setting, life continued to move gently, shaped by land, water, and time rather than ambition or urgency, each day adding its quiet presence to an unbroken flow. And as wind moved through branches and water traced its enduring paths, the ongoing coexistence of people and place remained steady, unremarkable, and continuous, carrying forward softly, without pause, without boundary, and without end. And within this steady unfolding, attention continued to rest on what was immediately present, the texture of bark beneath a resting hand, the faint vibration of water moving under thin ice, the way breath appeared briefly in cold air before dissolving, and these sensations grounded each moment without needing to be named, forming a quiet continuity between awareness and environment that required no effort to maintain. Along the slopes where forests thinned toward open ground, grasses and low plants shifted gradually with wind and season, their movement offering subtle guidance about weather and time. And people passing through these areas adjusted their clothing and pace instinctively, drawing coverings closer or loosening them, choosing routes that followed natural contours rather than cutting directly across. And this responsiveness reduced strain, allowing movement to feel like an extension of the land itself. Waterways continued to serve as gentle connectors, carrying not only people and goods, but also shared understanding. And when boats passed one another on wide rivers or narrow channels, acknowledgement took the form of a glance, a slight adjustment, of course, or a brief pause, gestures sufficient to affirm mutual presence without interrupting flow, and after passing, each continued on without residue. The preparation of food remained a central yet understated activity, carried out with patience. Ingredients combined slowly, flavors developing over time rather than through haste, and meals reflected the surrounding landscape closely, tasting of water, soil, and season, reinforcing connection through repetition rather than variety, and nourishment was understood as both physical and relational, sustaining body and continuity alike. As the long rhythm of seasons continued to repeat with subtle variation, certain tasks returned reliably, mending before winter, gathering before thaw, preparing before travel, and these cycles created a sense of orientation that did not rely on counting or record, but on the familiarity of sequence, one action naturally following another, each signaling the readiness for what came next. Shelters continued to evolve quietly, some expanding slightly to accommodate growing families, others simplifying as needs changed, and these modifications were guided by experience rather than design. Walls thickened where wind pressed hardest, openings adjusted to capture light or avoid it, and each structure reflected accumulated understanding rather than a fixed plan. Further along the interior waterways, the exchange of knowledge persisted through casual interaction. A new knot demonstrated briefly, a fishing method adjusted after observation, a plant identified through shared gathering, and these moments passed quickly, yet their influence extended far beyond the moment itself, carried forward through practice rather than memory alone. As people aged, their movements slowed naturally, and their roles shifted without announcement, time spent closer to shelter, attention turning toward tasks that required steadiness rather than strength, and younger individuals stepped into more demanding work seamlessly, the transition occurring without formal recognition because continuity mattered more than role. The land continued to absorb these transitions effortlessly, maintaining its steady presence through growth and decay, and even when traces of earlier use remained faintly visible, old clearings now softened by new growth, worn paths fading beneath leaf fall. These remnants felt less like markers of the past and more like layers within an ongoing process. Weather continued its quiet dialogue with terrain, rain moving differently across forest, field, and stone, snow accumulating unevenly depending on wind and shelter, and people read these patterns carefully, adjusting storage, travel, and effort accordingly, and this attentiveness reduced risk without eliminating uncertainty, allowing variability to remain part of life rather than something to be controlled. As light withdrew once more toward shorter days, activity naturally condensed, evenings growing longer, and interior spaces filling with subdued motion, hands busy, voices low, silence frequent, and the outside world remained present through sound and subtle vibration, wind against walls, distant water movement, reminding those within that the broader landscape continued its own rhythms uninterrupted. And so, within this layered stillness and motion, the quiet coexistence endured, not as a preserved state, but as a living process, shaped continually by land, water, and time. And as each day blended gently into the next, the story of this place continued to unfold without emphasis or conclusion, carried forward by the same patient forces that had always guided it, remaining open, ongoing, and softly present, without pause. And with the same gentle consistency, the landscape continued to invite attention without demand, offering its cues through temperature shifts felt on skin, through the way sound carried farther on clear days and folded inward when air grew heavy, and these signals shaped behavior quietly, encouraging certain tasks to be taken up and others set aside, not through decision but through alignment with what the moment allowed. Along shallow inlets where fresh and salt water mingled, grasses bent differently with each tide, and people gathering there learn to read these movements as easily as they read their own hands, selecting times to wade or launch that felt right rather than calculated. And the water accepted their presence without disruption, closing again around footprints as soon as they passed. The forests maintained their layered calm, older trees standing with measured patience, while younger growth filled the spaces between, and this interweaving of ages offered shelter and material in equal measure. Branches taken selectively, fallen wood gathered after storms, and nothing hurried, because the forest itself demonstrated that growth did not require speed to be enduring. As the years continued their quiet accumulation, subtle preferences developed in different places, certain valleys favoring particular crops, certain shorelines yielding specific fish, and these tendencies were observed and respected, guiding activity without restriction, allowing each area to express its character while remaining part of a larger connected whole. Travel remained purposeful yet unforced, undertaken when need or curiosity arose, routes chosen for familiarity rather than efficiency, and along the way small exchanges occurred naturally, a shared meal, a brief collaboration, an update offered without insistence, and these interactions strengthened connection without creating obligation, because each person understood that movement itself carried continuity. The passing of time left its traces most clearly in the way tasks were anticipated rather than remembered. Preparation beginning before need became urgent, storage checked without prompting, repairs undertaken gradually, and this foresight reduced strain, allowing effort to remain steady and calm, spread evenly across days rather than concentrated into moments of urgency. As night settled again, light from hearths softened interior spaces, shadows moving slowly across walls shaped by years of adaptation, and outside, the land rested in its own way, water continuing to move beneath darkness, animals shifting quietly through familiar paths, and these unseen motions formed part of the same enduring rhythm. In the longer view, distinctions between generations blurred, habits repeating with slight variation, preferences shifting gently, and the sense of inheritance resided not in objects or names but in ways of noticing, in the practiced ability to pause, to observe, and to respond without haste, and this capacity persisted, carried forward through shared experience rather than instruction. Weather patterns continued their gradual evolution, some years favoring growth, others encouraging restraint, and the response remained consistent. Adaptation without resistance, acceptance without passivity, and this balance sustained resilience without the need for control, allowing uncertainty to coexist comfortably with preparation. Along the broad sweep of coastline and the winding reach of rivers, life continued to align itself with the slow movement of tides and seasons, adjusting course when needed, returning when conditions allowed, and the land held these patterns gently, shaping and being shaped in return, without boundary between influence and response. And within this ongoing interplay, the quiet narrative persisted, not advancing toward a destination but unfolding steadily, each moment resting within the next, guided by the same patient forces that had always been present, and as wind moved through grasses and water, reflected the changing sky, the continuity of people and place remained intact, flowing onward without interruption, without culmination, and without end. And in this ongoing ease, the land continued to offer small invitations that were answered without ceremony, a stretch of shoreline revealed briefly by a lower tide, a stand of berries ripening unevenly across a slope, a corridor of calmer water opening between shifting winds, and these opportunities were met as they appeared, neither pursued nor ignored, simply incorporated into the steady fabric of daily movement. Along paths that threaded through forest and meadow, footsteps remained light, adjusting to ground softened by rain or firmed by frost, and the roots themselves altered subtly over time, bending around new growth, favoring shaded ground during warmer months. And these changes required no marking, because memory and attention provided sufficient guidance, and travel continued without interruption or confusion. The work of making and maintaining remained distributed across days and hands, tasks begun and set aside as conditions suggested, returning to them when light or weather aligned, and this flexibility prevented accumulation of strain, allowing effort to be balanced and sustained, and tools rested between uses without neglect, their readiness assumed rather than ensured. As the rivers carried on their slow dialogue with the land, depositing silt in some places and clearing stone in others, people responded by shifting their use gently, moving landings, adjusting fishing spots, allowing the river's preferences to shape interaction, and this attentiveness preserved the water's vitality, keeping its flow clear and responsive. In moments of gathering, when several households shared space for a time, activity unfolded without structure, work and rest intermingling, individuals contributing where inclination and ability met, and these periods reinforced familiarity without formal bonds, ensuring that connection remained light and adaptable, capable of stretching and contracting as circumstances changed. The passage of seasons continued to be felt more through sensation than through record. The angle of sunlight across familiar surfaces, the sound of insects emerging or receding, the quality of air during certain hours, and these cues oriented life effectively, providing a sense of timing that required no external reference, only presence. As materials aged and returned to the land, their absence created space for new making, and this cycle repeated quietly, reinforcing the understanding that continuity depended not on preservation of objects, but on the persistence of knowledge and attention, and this understanding shaped choices naturally, without need for articulation. Along higher elevations, where views opened wider and wind carried more freely, pauses occurred naturally, offering perspective without prompting reflection, and people lingered briefly, adjusting loads or simply standing, allowing the breadth of land and sky to register, and then movement resumed, guided by the same steady rhythm as before. Night after night, the transition from light to dark unfolded gradually, tasks narrowing in scope, sound softening, and the boundary between waking and rest remaining gentle, and even in sleep, the presence of the surrounding world persisted, felt through temperature, sound, and the steady support of familiar shelter. As the long flow of time continued, the subtle interplay between continuity and change remained balanced, no single influence overwhelming another, and this equilibrium sustained a way of living that neither resisted alteration nor sought novelty, content instead with responsiveness and care. And so, across forests, rivers, and coasts, shaped by countless small adjustments, the quiet life of this place continued to unfold, each moment resting within the next, carried forward by land, water, and the attentive presence of those who moved among them, without conclusion, without urgency, and without end. as the steady breath of time flowed on. And as this steady breath of time moved onward, the land continued to shape attention through its smallest details, the way dew gathered more thickly in certain hollows, the faint change in scent carried on evening air when rain approached from far away. And these subtleties guided behavior long before any visible sign appeared, allowing preparation to unfold quietly without conscious anticipation. Along the edges of cultivated ground, where human tending met the slower intentions of wild growth, boundaries remained soft and negotiable, plants spreading where conditions favored them, retreating where shade or moisture shifted, and people responded by adjusting care rather than enforcing limits, thinning here, allowing growth there, and in this exchange both order and spontaneity found room to coexist without conflict. The movement of water through the landscape continued to influence patterns of settlement and travel, small channels forming during heavy seasons and disappearing again as ground dried, and these temporary paths were remembered not as fixed routes but as possibilities, revisited when conditions aligned and forgotten easily when they no longer served, keeping movement adaptable and light. As years continued their quiet layering, the sense of shared time deepened, not through shared milestones but through accumulated familiarity, the recognition of recurring moments that felt known even when they differed slightly each time. And this recognition fostered ease, reducing the impulse to compare or measure, allowing experience to be accepted as it arrived. The making of shelter remained an ongoing conversation with environment, roofs adjusted to shed snow or capture rain, walls angled to break wind or invite warmth, and these changes occurred incrementally, guided by lived experience rather than design, and each adjustment carried forward into future choices, shaping the character of dwellings without fixing them permanently. In the spaces between activity, stillness remained present and valued, not as absence of work but as part of the same continuum, moments spent observing cloud movement, listening to distant water, or simply resting without intention, and these pauses refreshed attention, ensuring that engagement with the land remained perceptive rather than habitual. The exchange of goods and skills continued to flow gently along established routes, never accumulating into systems of accumulation, but circulating steadily, meeting needs as they arose and dissolving back into everyday life. And this circulation reinforced connection without dependence, allowing each place to remain largely self-sustaining while still open to shared support. As climate continued its gradual shifts over long spans, subtle changes in vegetation and animal presence emerged, and people noticed these developments without alarm, adjusting practices slowly, experimenting cautiously, and allowing time to reveal what would persist, trusting that responsiveness rather than intervention offered the most durable path. The night continued to hold its quiet authority, drawing activity inward, encouraging rest and reflection without requiring explanation, and even as darkness settled, the sense of continuity remained unbroken, carried by familiar sounds, by the steady presence of others nearby, and by the knowledge that morning would arrive in its own time. Through all of this, the land remained neither backdrop nor resource alone, but an active participant in daily life, shaping and being shaped through countless small interactions that accumulated into enduring patterns. And within this ongoing relationship, human presence remained integrated rather than imposed, contributing gently to the larger rhythm. And so, As wind continued to move through trees and grasses, as water traced its patient routes towards sea and lake, and as light shifted endlessly across familiar ground, the quiet unfolding of life persisted, each moment flowing into the next without boundary or destination, sustained by attention, balance, and the slow, generous passage of time that continued onward, softly, endlessly, without pause. And within that continuing movement, subtle variations kept emerging, almost imperceptible at first, such as the way certain trees leaned more noticeably after winters of heavier snow, or how shorelines shifted a little each season as ice retreated and returned. And these changes were absorbed into memory without urgency, becoming part of what was expected and gently accounted for. Paths worn by repeated passage never hardened fully into permanence, remaining flexible traces that could soften or fade when use diminished. And when new growth crossed them, no effort was made to restore what had been, allowing movement to follow present conditions rather than past habits, and this willingness to let go preserved an ease in daily rhythms. Languages continued to drift toward one another, not through deliberate blending but through shared activity, certain words settling into common use because they suited the shape of the work or the feel of the land, sounds adjusting subtly over generations until their origins became less distinct, carrying meaning shaped more by use than by lineage. Seasonal gatherings remained simple and unmarked by ceremony, occasions where exchange occurred naturally through proximity, stories shared in fragments rather than full accounts, gestures and expressions conveying as much as spoken language, and these moments reinforced familiarity without formal acknowledgement, strengthening bonds through repetition rather than declaration. Tools evolved slowly, guided by hands that understood both inherited forms and local materials, handles shaped to fit palms accustomed to long use, edges maintained rather than replaced, and when tools wore beyond usefulness, their materials returned to other purposes, leaving no sense of loss, only transition. Children grew into the landscape as much as into community, learning through observation rather than instruction, absorbing knowledge from watching elders prepare food, repair shelters, or read weather signs, and this learning occurred without pressure, unfolding at a pace set by curiosity and readiness. Animals continued to share the terrain, their movements anticipated but not controlled, their presence accepted as part of the same web of living patterns, and hunting remained measured, attentive to balance rather than yield, ensuring that absence never outweighed presence over time. The relationship with water deepened as familiarity increased. Currents read like subtle language, ice thickness judged by sound and texture, tides noted not by calculation but by experience, and this understanding allowed safe passage and sustained use without imposing structures that would interrupt flow. As generations overlapped, memory extended beyond individual lifetimes, held collectively through habit and place, certain clearings remembered as resting grounds, certain bends in rivers known for their quiet, and these associations guided behavior gently, without need for markers or records. Weather continued its patient dialogue with land and life, storms arriving without spectacle, leaving behind adjustments rather than disruption, and recovery followed naturally, materials gathered, shelters repaired, routines resumed with minimal commentary, reinforcing resilience through acceptance. Throughout these slow passages of time, the sense of belonging remained diffuse, not centered on ownership or boundaries, but on familiarity and participation, and this belonging allowed movement without dislocation, change without rupture, continuity without fixation. And so the days continued to arrive and pass, light shifting across familiar forms, sounds rising and falling with wind and water, and within this ongoing weave, life persisted in a state of quiet attention, unfolding steadily, without aim or conclusion, carried forward by the same gentle forces that had always guided it, moving onward, softly, without end. And with that same unhurried persistence, the land continued to hold traces of all that had passed through it, not as clear marks but as subtle tendencies, the way certain meadows seemed to invite rest more than others, or how some stretches of forest carried sound differently, encouraging quieter movement. And these tendencies were learned gradually, through repeated presence rather than instruction. Along the coasts where salt air met forest edge, structures remained low and adaptable, their forms shifting slightly over generations as materials changed and techniques adjusted, driftwood finding new purpose beside carefully shaped beams, surfaces weathering into colors that echoed stone and bark, until built space felt less like an addition and more like a variation of what already existed. Food preparation followed the same gentle blending, methods merging without deliberate choice, smoke rising slowly from hearths that combined old practices with local rhythms, flavors evolving through availability rather than preference, and meals remained simple, shaped by season and circumstance, shared without ceremony, sustaining both body and routine. As seasons continued their quiet rotation, the soundscape shifted almost imperceptibly, insects emerging earlier or later depending on warmth, birds altering routes subtly over decades, and these changes were noticed not as loss or gain but as difference, each variation folded calmly into expectation. Clothing and coverings reflected similar attentiveness, fibers chosen for feel and durability, layers adjusted rather than replaced, repairs favored over renewal, and garments carried the marks of long use without stigma, becoming familiar extensions of the wearer's movement through daily tasks. Fire remained a constant presence, treated with care and respect, its role steady and contained, offering warmth and light without dominance, and its maintenance provided a rhythm that marked evenings and mornings alike, anchoring time without measuring it. The sharing of space remained fluid, dwellings opening or closing as needed, visitors staying for stretches that felt neither brief nor permanent, and departure carried no finality, only a sense of ongoing circulation as people moved with seasons, opportunities, or quiet inclination. Over many lifetimes, the shoreline itself shifted gently, tides reshaping inlets, sediments collecting and dispersing, and communities adjusted their orientation without resistance, paths rerouted, landing places redefined, maintaining alignment with the living edge rather than attempting to fix it. Belief and understanding continued to reside close to observation, meanings drawn from repeated encounters with weather, growth, and decay. And rather than forming rigid explanations, these understandings remained flexible, accommodating contradiction and change without tension. In moments of collective stillness, when activity paused naturally, attention turned outward toward the movement of clouds, the gradual dimming of light, the steady presence of others nearby, and these shared quiet intervals reinforced connection without articulation. And so, with the slow movement of time carrying everything forward, life along these coasts and rivers continued to unfold in measured continuity, shaped by patience, attentiveness, and acceptance, each day emerging from the last and dissolving gently into the next, as wind passed through branches and water followed its enduring paths, and the land, remembering all of it, remained present, quietly sustaining the ongoing flow. And within that sustained presence, the smallest cycles continued to assert their quiet influence, frost forming patterns on shallow pools that melted by mid-morning, leaving behind softened edges that gradually returned to their former shape. And these minor transformations offered reassurance through their familiarity, reinforcing trust in repetition rather than permanence. Woodlands thickened in some places and thinned in others, guided by light and moisture more than intention, and people adjusted their paths accordingly, stepping around fallen trunks, choosing new clearings for gathering, allowing regeneration to proceed without interference, knowing from long experience that absence often prepared the ground for return. The sound of tools against stone or wood blended easily into the broader soundscape, never dominating it, rhythms aligning unconsciously with breathing and movement, and work unfolded without urgency, measured by daylight and physical comfort rather than expectation, ending naturally when conditions suggested rest. As rivers continued their steady travel, carrying stories from interior to coast, subtle differences in watercolor and temperature were observed and remembered, indicating upstream conditions long before any visible sign appeared. And this awareness fostered preparation that felt intuitive rather than planned. Generations continued to overlap gently, elders remaining present within daily activity rather than set apart, their knowledge expressed through demonstration and habit, and as physical pace slowed, attention deepened, offering guidance through presence more than instruction. Materials moved through cycles of use and reuse, stone repositioned, wood reshaped, fibers returned to soil, and nothing remained static long enough to acquire symbolic weight, maintaining a sense of continuity that favored flow over accumulation. As seasons passed into one another, boundaries between them softened, winter easing into spring without clear division, warmth returning gradually, plants responding in staggered rhythms, and this lack of abrupt change allowed adaptation to occur quietly, without disruption. The blending of customs continued at the level of daily choice, gestures borrowed and retained because they fit, songs altered in cadence and tone until their origins blurred, and meaning resided more in feeling than in preservation, ensuring relevance without fixation. Travel between settlements remained light and infrequent, guided by necessity rather than schedule, visits extending or shortening based on weather and inclination, and upon return, absence was noted briefly before routines resumed, confirming that connection persisted without constant reinforcement. Night skies shifted slowly over centuries, stars appearing to drift relative to familiar landmarks, and these changes were noticed and accepted as part of a larger movement beyond immediate concern, reinforcing humility within the vastness of time. Through all these continuities, the land maintained its quiet authority, not directing but influencing, offering cues rather than commands, and human presence remained responsive, adjusting posture, pace, and practice in alignment with what unfolded naturally. And so the slow weaving of life continued, each moment arising from countless prior moments, sustained by attention, patience, and balance. As water moved steadily through its channels, wind traced familiar paths through trees, and the memory of place extended forward without boundary, carrying everything gently onward, still unfolding, still becoming, without end. And as that becoming carried on, scarcely marked by any single change, the texture of days continued to be shaped by modest variations, a slightly longer twilight lingering over water, a different quality of silence after snowfall, and these variations were absorbed into routine without comment, reinforcing the sense that time was not something moving past, but something gently widening. Along inland waterways, canoes and small boats rested lightly against banks, their forms refined over many lifetimes to sit comfortably in shallow or moving water, and when they were drawn out for use, their passage disturbed the surface only briefly, ripples spreading and dissolving until the river resumed its familiar stillness. Gardens and tended clearings remained modest in scale, interwoven with surrounding growth rather than separated from it, and planting followed patterns learned through quiet observation, seeds placed where moisture lingered longest or where sun arrived at a steady angle, allowing cultivation to feel like encouragement rather than control. As winters arrived and withdrew, snow became another material to work with, paths compressed by repeated steps, entrances shaped to manage drift. Light reflected upward into dwellings, extending the day softly, and when thaw returned, meltwater was guided gently aside, preventing erosion without rigid barriers. Shared spaces evolved almost unnoticed, a bench added near a doorway, stones arranged near water for resting or sorting nets, and these additions remained open to adaptation, moved or removed when no longer useful, leaving behind only faint impressions that blended back into the ground. The passing of time continued to be marked less by age than by familiarity, hands knowing what to do without instruction, eyes reading subtle cues in sky and soil, and learning persisted as an ongoing process, never complete, always responsive to what the present moment required. The blending of beliefs remained quiet and practical, reverence expressed through care rather than ritual, acknowledgement of forces larger than any single life conveyed through restraint and attentiveness, and understanding remained provisional, shaped by experience and open to revision. Animals moved through shared spaces with increasing ease, accustomed to predictable human patterns, their presence neither romanticized nor ignored, and coexistence settled into a steady balance that required ongoing awareness but little deliberation. As coastal fog rolled inland and retreated again, it softened outlines and muted sound, encouraging slower movement and closer attention, and when it lifted, the return of distance felt gentle rather than abrupt, restoring familiar landmarks without altering their meaning. The flow of seasons continued to erase sharp distinctions, years folding into one another, memory held collectively through place rather than record, and the land itself carried these layers quietly, offering continuity without insisting on permanence. Through all of this, there remained no sense of arrival, no moment that suggested completion, only an ongoing alignment between people, place, and time, each influencing the other through countless small adjustments. And as water continued its patient travel, as wind returned again and again along known paths, the slow unfolding persisted, unmarked, unhurried, extending forward as it always had, without boundary, without conclusion, still moving, still remembering. And within that remembering, attention continued to rest on ordinary moments that carried quiet significance. The careful placing of a vessel near water so it would not drift away overnight. The way smoke curled differently depending on humidity, lingering low on some mornings and lifting quickly on others. And these observations guided small adjustments that accumulated into enduring ease. The forests inland continued to change their character subtly. Younger growth filling spaces left by older trees, understory plants shifting in response to light, and movement through these areas adapted naturally, steps slowing where density increased, paths widening again when openness returned, ensuring that passage remained attentive rather than habitual. Along rivers that curved gently through low ground, seasonal flooding deposited fine layers of soil, enriching banks without warning or announcement, and planting followed these quiet gifts, timed not by calendar but by touch and sight, hands testing moisture, eyes noting color and texture, allowing cultivation to align with natural rhythm. Shelters remained permeable to their surroundings, doors opened when weather allowed, light entering freely, sounds passing through, and even when closed against cold or wind, awareness of outside conditions remained present, carried through subtle changes in air and sound that informed decisions without urgency. The sharing of labor continued to occur without formal arrangement, tasks taken up by those present, assistance offered and accepted fluidly, and completion carried no sense of obligation beyond the moment, reinforcing trust through repetition rather than agreement. As centuries passed almost unnoticed, the blended communities developed a shared patience, an understanding that not all outcomes needed to be immediate or visible, and this patience shaped interactions with land and one another alike, reducing friction and allowing variation to settle naturally. Materials gathered from shore and forest continue to circulate through use. Stones warmed by fire placed carefully to hold heat longer. Fibers woven loosely enough to breathe, and each object remained responsive, adaptable to changing conditions rather than fixed to a single purpose. Evenings continued to gather quietly, light diminishing gradually, activities tapering without signal, and rest arrived as a continuation rather than a break. Bodies settling into familiar patterns shaped by long familiarity with daylight and temperature. The movement of people across the landscape remained gentle and infrequent, journeys taken when needed, pauses welcomed when conditions suggested waiting, and upon arrival, presence integrated smoothly, without announcement, as if always expected. Through all of this, the land continued to guide without instruction, offering cues through subtle shifts that were noticed only because attention remained steady, and this attentiveness sustained balance, preventing excess and encouraging restraint. And so the slow passage of time continued to carry everything forward, moments layering upon moments, each one complete yet open, as water followed its enduring paths, as wind traced familiar routes through branches and grass, and as life, shaped by patience and observation, unfolded endlessly, without edge or resolution, still moving, still listening, still becoming. And as that quiet becoming continued, the rhythms of daily care remained steady, the tending of nets laid out to dry in partial shade, turned at intervals learned through long familiarity with sun and breeze, and when threads weakened, they were repaired patiently rather than replaced, the act of mending itself reinforcing continuity. In marshlands, where fresh and salt water mingled, plant life adjusted subtly from season to season, reeds thickening or thinning, channels shifting their course by small degrees, and those who gathered there learned to read these signs intuitively, approaching along routes that revealed themselves gradually rather than being imposed. The passage of animals left traces that were observed without urgency, tracks softening overnight, feeding grounds changing position over years, and this knowledge guided movement and harvest gently, ensuring that presence remained light and responsive. Sound continued to travel differently across open water and forest floor, voices carrying farther at dawn, absorbed more fully at dusk, and this awareness shaped communication, encouraging closeness and reducing the need for distance, fostering a quiet intimacy within shared spaces. Over long spans of time, architectural forms continued to adapt without conscious design, roofs lowering slightly to manage wind, walls opening where light lingered longest, and these gradual refinements accumulated into dwellings that felt grown rather than built, fitting their surroundings with ease. The blending of lineage became less about origin and more about shared habit, family understood through proximity and care rather than descent, and identity rested comfortably in participation, allowing each person to belong without needing definition. Weather patterns continued to shift in small increments, summers lengthening by moments, winters easing without announcement, and these changes were met with the same attentiveness that had always guided adaptation, adjustments made quietly, stored knowledge refined rather than replaced. At night, the steady presence of stars remained a familiar reference, their slow movement across generations noted but never measured, reinforcing a sense of scale that placed daily concerns gently within a larger continuity. The exchange of stories persisted as fragments woven into conversation, moments recalled not to preserve the past but to inform the present, and these recollections remained fluid, changing shape as they passed between people, retaining feeling more than detail. Through all these ongoing interactions, the land continued to remember. Alongside those who lived within it, memory held not in records but in patterns of growth, wear, and renewal, offering guidance through familiarity rather than instruction. And so the slow unfolding carried on, each day arising naturally from the one before, shaped by observation, restraint, and care, as water continued its patient movement, as wind returned along known paths, and as life remained suspended within this gentle flow, ongoing and unbounded, still attentive, still present, still quietly becoming. And within that ongoing presence, even the smallest gestures continued to carry weight through repetition rather than emphasis, the habitual turning of soil with the same motion each season, the placing of stones along an edge where erosion tended to return. And these gestures required no reflection, unfolding as naturally as breathing, shaped by long familiarity with place. Mist rose from rivers at dawn and lingered longer in certain bends, cooling the air and softening distance, and movement slowed accordingly. Steps adjusted to reduced visibility, voices lowered instinctively, and when the mist thinned, clarity returned without marking a transition, allowing activity to resume seamlessly. Along forest margins, light filtered unevenly, shifting with the angle of the sun across the year, and this shifting light guided growth and gathering alike. Certain plants favored in partial shade, others thriving only where brightness lingered, and knowledge of these preferences remained embodied rather than recorded. As time continued to layer itself gently, repairs became indistinguishable from creation. A beam replaced here, a woven panel reinforced there, and dwellings carried no fixed moment of completion, existing instead as ongoing processes responsive to weather, use, and the quiet preferences of those who lived within them. The sharing of food remained unremarkable yet central, portions adjusted by availability rather than rule, leftovers finding new form the following day, and sustenance flowed steadily without excess, reinforcing balance through habit rather than restraint. Across open stretches of water, reflections shifted constantly, clouds mirrored and distorted, light broken into moving fragments, and these surfaces were watched without interpretation, offering calm through their constant variation, reminding attention that change need not disrupt continuity. As generations continued to overlap, teaching remained indirect, occurring through shared presence and repeated action. Mistakes absorbed gently into learning, corrections offered through example rather than instruction, allowing confidence to develop without pressure. The land continued to shape posture and pace, inclines encouraging shorter steps, uneven ground fostering attentiveness, and bodies adapted subtly over time, movement becoming economical and quiet, aligned with terrain rather than imposed upon it. Seasonal work followed the same unhurried logic, preparation beginning early enough to avoid urgency, completion arriving before necessity pressed, and this foresight emerged not from planning but from long acquaintance with cycles that rarely surprised. Even in periods of scarcity or abundance, response remained measured, neither tightening nor expanding dramatically, trusting that fluctuation was part of continuity and that balance would reassert itself through attentiveness rather than intervention. And so the slow passage continued to carry all things forward, not toward a destination but within an enduring flow, where land, water, and human presence remained intertwined through countless small adjustments, each moment resting comfortably within the next, as wind traced its familiar routes, as rivers followed their patient courses, and as this quiet remembering extended onward, without boundary, without conclusion, still unfolding, still alive. And as that quiet aliveness persisted, the spaces between actions continued to matter as much as the actions themselves. Pauses taken naturally while watching clouds thicken or thin, hands resting briefly against warm stone, and these intervals softened the passage of hours, preventing time from feeling segmented or scarce. In low valleys where cold air settled, frost lingered longer after sunrise, shaping planting choices without discussion, and those who worked there learned to wait a little more patiently, allowing warmth to arrive fully before disturbing the ground, trusting that timing revealed itself through sensation rather than decision. The sound of water against hulls or shore changed subtly with season and weather, sometimes hollow and distant, sometimes close and resonant, and these variations guided approach and departure, encouraging attentiveness without instruction, movement aligning instinctively with condition. As wood aged, its surface softened, edges rounded by handling and exposure, and this wear was welcomed, offering better grip and familiarity, turning objects into companions rather than tools, each one carrying the quiet record of shared time. The flow of conversation remained sparse and unforced, words chosen carefully but without effort, silence filling space comfortably, allowing presence to communicate what language need not, and understanding settled through shared rhythm rather than explanation. Across generations, preferences shifted gently. Certain foods favored more often, certain routes chosen more frequently, and these tendencies emerged organically, shaped by experience and environment rather than intention, giving culture a fluid quality that resisted fixation. The land continued to respond in kind, grasses returning where pressure eased, trees reclaiming abandoned clearings, and this responsiveness reinforced humility, reminding those who lived there that influence moved in both directions, neither dominant nor passive. As twilight arrived earlier or later across the year, activity adjusted smoothly, tasks compressing or expanding to fit available light, and artificial illumination remained minimal, allowing night to retain its depth and quiet authority. Memory continued to reside in places rather than narratives, a certain bend in the path recalling countless passages, a familiar shoreline evoking prior seasons without specific images, and this form of remembering required no effort, present whenever attention lingered. Weather events came and went without being framed as events, rain soaking in gradually, wind passing through and leaving behind rearranged branches, and response followed naturally, repairs made where needed, adjustments incorporated without commentary. Through all of this, the sense of continuity remained intact, not because nothing changed, but because change occurred within a shared attentiveness that smoothed its edges, allowing adaptation without disruption. And so the unfolding continued, moment by moment, season by season, life carried gently within the land's slow awareness, as water continued its steady movement, as wind returned again along familiar paths, and as this quiet, enduring flow extended onward, unbroken, unhurried, still becoming, still remembering, without limit. And within that limitlessness, the subtle choreography of daily movement remained attuned to the smallest signals, a change in wind direction prompting a different route along the shore, the thickness of ice judged by tone rather than sight, and these judgments were made quietly, without consultation, arising from long familiarity rather than conscious choice. Fields that had once been cleared gradually softened at their edges, shrubs returning, trees advancing slowly, and cultivation shifted inward without resistance, acknowledging the land's steady inclination toward renewal. And this retreat was not seen as loss, but as part of an ongoing exchange that preserved balance. Along higher ground, where stone emerged close to the surface, dwellings took on a slightly different character, foundations settling into irregular contours, walls following natural lines, and the interiors holding temperature more steadily, these variations accepted and appreciated for the comfort they provided rather than their distinction. The movement of seasons continued to influence sound as much as sight, snow muting footsteps, fallen leaves amplifying them, and this awareness shaped timing and approach, encouraging gentler passage and reducing unnecessary disturbance. Fishing practices remained responsive rather than fixed, nets set or lifted based on water clarity and current, hands feeling tension and release, and success measured not by quantity but by sufficiency, ensuring that effort remained proportional to need. As time carried on, the blending of artistic expression remained understated, patterns appearing in weaving or carving that echoed both inherited forms and local motifs, and these expressions existed primarily for use, beauty emerging as a byproduct rather than an aim. Children continued to absorb this environment through play that mirrored daily life, building small shelters, tracing animal paths, learning limits through experience rather than instruction, and this exploration fostered confidence grounded in understanding rather than assertion. The presence of elders remained integrated, their slower pace offering a counterpoint to activity, attention lingering on details others passed by, and this attentiveness enriched collective awareness, reinforcing the value of observation over haste. Travelers arriving from farther along the coast or inland brought subtle variations in habit and speech. These differences noticed briefly before being absorbed, contributing to gradual change without disruption, maintaining openness without dilution. As nights lengthened or shortened, sleep patterns adjusted naturally, rest taken when darkness deepened, waking with returning light, and this alignment reduced strain, allowing bodies to move in step with broader rhythms. The land continued to offer guidance through repetition, patterns emerging clearly only over time, and those who lived within it trusted this guidance, allowing it to shape decisions without demanding certainty. And so the quiet continuity persisted, each adjustment reinforcing the next, life unfolding within a shared attentiveness that honored change without chasing it. As water continued along its patient routes, as wind traced its familiar passages, and as the long remembering of place extended forward, gently, endlessly, still unfolding, still present, without boundary. And as that shared attentiveness remained intact, the passing of days continued to soften distinctions that might otherwise have stood apart, the memory of one season blending gently into the expectation of the next, and this blending eased the mind into a steady acceptance of flow, where nothing needed to be held tightly in order to remain present. In sheltered coves, water rested more quietly, reflecting sky and shoreline with slight distortion, and these calm places invited slower movement, boats drawn up and left for a time, hands resting idly against familiar wood. And when departure came, it arose without signal, as naturally as arrival had once occurred. The interior forests carried their own steady cadence, light shifting gradually across trunks and moss, sound absorbed and released depending on moisture and leaf, and those who moved there learned to listen as much as to look, trusting the body's response to subtle cues that guided safe and gentle passage. As materials aged and returned to soil or water, new ones took their place without urgency, gathered when conditions favored it, shaped with care that came from long acquaintance rather than novelty. And this cycle maintained continuity without repetition, ensuring that nothing remained fixed long enough to become rigid. The exchange between communities continued at a pace set by weather and inclination, visits unfolding slowly, shared tasks filling time without schedule, and when parting occurred, it carried no sense of separation, only a pause in proximity that left connection intact. Across long spans of time, changes accumulated quietly, coastlines adjusting, forests shifting composition, and people adapted alongside these movements, practices refined, habits adjusted, always responsive, never hurried, allowing alignment to persist without strain. The night continued to offer its familiar enclosure, darkness settling evenly, sounds narrowing and then expanding again as morning approached, and rest followed these rhythms without resistance, bodies settling into patterns shaped by countless nights before. Understanding remained grounded in experience, explanations unnecessary where familiarity sufficed, and belief stayed close to observation, open-ended and flexible, accommodating what was known while leaving room for what remained beyond reach. Even moments of uncertainty were met with patience, waiting for conditions to clarify rather than forcing resolution, and this waiting reinforced trust in time itself as a collaborator rather than an obstacle. Through all of this, the land continued to hold and reflect the quiet imprint of those who lived within it, paths faint but persistent, clearings softened by return, and memory carried forward not as record but as tendency, guiding movement and care without insistence. And so the unfolding continued in its steady, unbroken way, each moment leaning gently into the next, sustained by balance, observation, and restraint, as water followed its enduring courses, as wind moved again through familiar branches, and as this long, patient remembering extended onward without threshold or closure, still flowing, still listening, still becoming.